Death lottery at Devil's Anvil, Marshal, Outlaw, King, and Apache bride collide in a deadly 1876 betrayal. Marshal Henry Carson had been a lawman for many years, a man whose name was known across the Arizona Territory. His reputation for bringing criminals to justice was unrivaled. He didn't ask for fame, nor did he care for the respect of the townsfolk, but what mattered to him was law and order. Carson didn't shy away from danger. He stood firm in the face of lawlessness, even when it seemed the odds were stacked against him. The sun beat down relentlessly over the small town of Devil's Anvil, nestled at the foot of a jagged mountain range. The name of the town was fitting. It was a place where survival was uncertain and death could strike at any moment. It was the perfect home for outlaws and thieves, men and women who saw no reason to follow the law. Carson knew the town well. He had walked its dusty streets more times than he cared to remember. But today felt different. A series of new developments had shaken the fragile peace that had settled over the town. The Apache tribe, who had long lived in the nearby deserts, had become more aggressive. For years, the Apache had been pushed off their land by settlers, only to see their land claimed by outsiders. Many had lost their homes and their freedom, and now they were fighting to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The arrival of Marshal Carson was not a coincidence. The town had been warned that trouble was coming, but the question was whether the law could stop it. The local authorities were either too corrupt or too afraid to act. So the people of Devil's Anvil turned to Carson for help. He rode into town with a grim expression, his worn-out boots making a soft clink on the cobblestones as he dismounted from his horse. His worn coat swayed in the dry breeze, and his sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. He knew that the violence from the Apache would not be easily stopped. They were not just warriors. They were people fighting for their survival. But Carson also knew that his role was to enforce the law, no matter who the enemy was. Marshal Carson wasn't afraid of the Apache. He had seen enough bloodshed in his career to last a lifetime. What bothered him was the people who manipulated the situation for their own gain. Powerful landowners, corrupt business leaders, and greedy cattle ranchers. These were the people Carson distrusted the most. They saw the Apache as a threat, not because of their actions, but because of the land they inhabited. Carson had heard rumors that the local ranchers had been using the Apache's lands for their own cattle grazing. The locals, who had lived in fear of Apache raids for years, began to grow restless, demanding action. But the truth was, the settlers weren't innocent victims. They were exploiting the situation to take advantage of the Apache's misfortune. One of the landowners, a man named Jebediah Blackstone, was known for his ruthless ways. He controlled much of the land in the region and had a group of hired guns who did his bidding. Carson had heard stories about Blackstone's brutality, how he would stop at nothing to expand his territory. He had a reputation as an outlaw king, a man who had built his empire through fear and violence. But Blackstone wasn't the only problem Carson had to face. There was also Ayanna, a woman caught in a world of conflict. Ayanna wasn't just any woman. She was a bride, forced into a marriage with Blackstone himself. Her beauty and strength were renowned, but she was not the one in control of her own fate. Instead, she had been wed to a man who used her as a means to secure his power. Her connection to Blackstone was complicated, and Carson knew it. She had not chosen this life, but she had no choice. She had been promised to Blackstone when she was still a child, a pawn in his game of conquest. But now as a woman, she was beginning to question the life she had been given. Marshal Carson had heard rumors of her beauty, but he was more interested in the truth behind her story. She was not just another woman caught up in the chaos. She was someone who could play a pivotal role in the conflict between the settlers and the Apache. But Carson couldn't figure out whether she was friend or foe. There were whispers that she secretly aided the Apache, feeding them information about Blackstone's plans. If those rumors were true, it would mean that Ayanna was far more dangerous than anyone realized. The town of Devil's Anvil was on the edge of war, and Carson could feel the tension in the air. The Apache were becoming bolder, striking settlers in the dead of night. In response, the local militia had been called to arms. But Carson knew that the militia was not enough. It was not just the Apache that needed to be dealt with. It was the lawlessness that had been allowed to fester in the town for so long. As he rode through the town square, he could feel the eyes of the people on him. Some looked at him with admiration, others with suspicion. Carson had never been one to worry about the opinions of others, but the weight of responsibility was heavy on his shoulders. He had promised to bring peace to the town, but it seemed that peace was a long way off. He made his way to the local saloon, a dusty building with a rickety porch. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the room. Carson's eyes scanned the crowd. looking for someone who could give him more information about what was happening in the area. A man named Jake, a former soldier who had been part of Carson's team in the past. Jake had a reputation for being reliable, though his loyalty was always in question. Carson knew that Jake had connections with the local ranchers, and he needed information about what they were planning. When Jake saw Carson enter the saloon, he stopped mid-sentence and gave a nod. Carson walked over to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "I need to know what's going on with Blackstone," Carson said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I know he's up to something, and I need to stop him before it gets worse." "Blackstone's been making deals with the Apaches. He's trying to take their land, Carson. That's why they're fighting back. They're not the savages people say they are." Carson's eyes narrowed. He had suspected as much. Blackstone was no different from the rest of the settlers who had exploited the Apache for years. But what did it mean for the future of the town? "I need to talk to Ayanna," Carson said. "She might know something that can help us." "You're walking into dangerous territory. Blackstone won't take kindly to anyone going near his bride. But if you're serious about stopping him, you'll need to talk to her. She's the key to this whole thing." Carson stood up, tipping his hat to Jake. "Thanks for the information." As he walked out of the saloon, Carson knew that his next move would be one of the most dangerous he had ever made. But he had no choice. The future of the town and perhaps the entire region depended on it. The law had to be upheld, and if he was the one to enforce it, then so be it. The pieces were in place. The Marshal, the Outlaw King, and the Apache bride were about to collide in a deadly confrontation that would forever change the fate of Devil's Anvil. Jebediah Blackstone was not a man to be trifled with. Known across the land as the Outlaw King, he commanded a ruthless group of followers who feared and respected him in equal measure. He had built his empire with iron fists and bloody deeds, all in the name of expanding his wealth and power. From the southern plains of Arizona to the mountains that surrounded Devil's Anvil, Blackstone's influence stretched far. He was a man who saw opportunity everywhere, and where others saw lawlessness, he saw a chance to make his mark. His name alone sent shivers down the spines of both settlers and outlaws alike, but for all his power and cruelty, there was one thing that Blackstone could never control: the Apache. They were the true rulers of the land, and despite years of conflict and bloodshed, they still held on to the lands that had belonged to them for centuries. This enraged Blackstone, who saw the Apache's resistance as an obstacle to his vision of domination. His hatred for them was well known, and he would stop at nothing to take what he believed was rightfully his. Blackstone had always been a man of strategy, and this time he had a plan to break the Apache's resistance once and for all. His latest move involved not only using his outlaw gangs, but also securing an unlikely ally, Ayanna. She was his wife, though the term was used loosely. In truth, Ayanna was more of a pawn in Blackstone's game, a beautiful woman whose strength and courage had caught his attention. He knew that her connection to the Apache would make her a valuable asset, even though she had little choice in the matter. Ayanna had been promised to Blackstone when she was just a young girl, and now, as a grown woman, she was nothing more than a tool for his ambitions. Despite the loveless marriage, she had a beauty that captivated everyone she met, and it was this very beauty that Blackstone had used to his advantage. However, Ayanna was no mere figurehead. Beneath her calm and composed exterior, she held a deep loyalty to her people. The Apache were her family, and her heart ached for them as they fought to defend their lands. Blackstone, of course, had no idea just how much Ayanna secretly supported the Apache cause. For all his cruelty, he was blind to her inner strength. She did everything in her power to help them, sending messages and aiding them from behind the scenes. She had to be careful, for any hint of disloyalty could cost her life. But in her heart, Ayanna knew that she couldn't stand by and let Blackstone wipe out the people she loved. When Marshal Carson arrived in Devil's Anvil, things began to change. At first, Carson was just another lawman in a long line of men who had tried and failed to stop Blackstone. But there was something different about him. Carson was determined and unafraid. He wasn't like the others who had simply come to collect their pay and leave. He had a deep sense of justice and an unwavering resolve. For weeks, Carson tried to learn more about Blackstone, but the Outlaw King was careful. He knew that if Carson had too much information, he might be able to stop him. But Carson wasn't just after Blackstone. He was also after the truth about the Apache. He had learned of the landowner's dealings with the Apache and suspected that Blackstone was somehow involved. The rumors were plentiful, but none of them were enough to piece the puzzle together. Carson knew that the key to stopping Blackstone and bringing peace to the region lay with Ayanna. The more Carson learned about her, the more intrigued he became. He had heard whispers that Ayanna wasn't just a pawn in Blackstone's game. She had a mind of her own, and many people in town believed she had more control than anyone realized. But Carson wasn't sure what to think. Was Ayanna a loyal wife to Blackstone, or was she secretly working against him? One evening, as the sun began to set over the desert, Carson stood at the edge of town, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before him. The air was thick with the dust of the dry desert, and the distant mountains loomed ominously in the background. He could almost feel the tension in the air, like a storm was about to break. He knew that everything was building up to something. Blackstone was on the verge of doing something drastic, and Carson was running out of time. That night, Ayanna made her move. She had received word from the Apache, warning her that Blackstone was preparing for another raid on their lands. She knew that the time to act had come. If she didn't stop him now, it could mean the end for her people. She had no choice but to reach out to Carson. It was risky, but she had no other option. Ayanna waited until the moon was high in the sky before slipping out of her husband's compound. She moved silently through the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step she took felt like a lifetime. She knew Blackstone would never forgive her if he found out what she was doing. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to stop him. She arrived at the place where Carson had agreed to meet her, a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Carson was already there, standing by the door with his hand on his gun. He didn't ask questions when Ayanna approached. She looked frightened, her eyes wide with urgency. Carson could see the fear in her face, but he also saw something else, something he hadn't expected. Ayanna wasn't afraid to risk everything for the sake of her people. "I know what Blackstone's planning," Ayanna said, her voice shaking. "He's going to attack the Apache tonight." "You have to stop him." Carson's heart raced as he listened to her words. He had known that Blackstone was up to something, but this was worse than he had imagined. Ayanna's revelation confirmed everything he had suspected, but he hadn't realized just how far Blackstone was willing to go. He could feel the weight of the decision in his chest. If he didn't act quickly, the Apache would be caught off guard. "I'll do what I can," Carson said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "But we need to act fast. Gather your people. I'll rally mine." Ayanna nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knew that this was a dangerous game they were playing, but it was a game she had no choice but to enter. Her heart belonged to the Apache, and she would do whatever it took to protect them. Carson, though a lawman, had become an unexpected ally. In that moment, she realized that perhaps there was hope after all. As the two of them set off to stop Blackstone, they didn't know what awaited them, but they knew that their fates were now tied together in this fight for justice. The battle that was about to unfold would change everything, and neither of them could predict how it would end. But one thing was certain. Blackstone's empire of violence was about to face its greatest challenge yet. Ayanna's heart was racing as she made her way through the shadows, her footsteps barely making a sound against the dirt ground. She had done it. She had managed to slip away unnoticed from Blackstone's compound, and now with the weight of the Apache's survival on her shoulders, she had to trust that Marshal Carson would be able to act in time. She knew the risks. If Blackstone found out what she had done, there would be no forgiveness. But she couldn't sit idly by while her people were about to face another deadly raid. This was her chance to help them, to make sure the violence and bloodshed didn't consume them all. Carson had promised to help, but Ayanna didn't know if she could trust him completely. Though his intentions seemed noble, the harsh truth was that Carson was a lawman. He was someone who had spent his career upholding the laws of a system that didn't always care for the Apache. The law often worked against her people, but Ayanna knew that Carson wasn't like the others. His reputation was built on a sense of fairness, and perhaps, just perhaps, he might be the ally she needed. But the reality was, no one could guarantee the outcome of the decisions they were about to make. As Ayanna walked through the moonlit night, her thoughts swirled. She remembered the day she had been forced to marry Blackstone. She had been just a girl, barely 16, promised to the outlaw by her family. They had thought the marriage would bring them protection, a way to survive in a world that was growing more dangerous every day. But they hadn't realized the cost of such an alliance. Ayanna had been trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, her every move controlled by a man who only valued her as a symbol of his power. At first she had tried to make the best of the situation. She had tried to ignore the gnawing sense of resentment growing in her chest, the way Blackstone treated her more like a possession than a partner. But over time, as his cruelty became more apparent, her resolve had strengthened. She began secretly aiding the Apache, passing along vital information about Blackstone's plans and the activities of his outlaw gang. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't sit by while her people suffered. When Carson had arrived in town, Ayanna had heard whispers of his arrival, but she hadn't paid much attention at first. Lawmen were common enough, but there was something about Carson that caught her attention. He wasn't like the other men who came and went, passing through town without leaving a trace. Carson was different. He wasn't just here to enforce the law. He seemed to care about the people, the ones who were suffering under the oppression of men like Blackstone. When the opportunity came to speak with him, Ayanna had taken the risk. She had told him everything. She had shared the truth about Blackstone's plans, hoping that it would be enough to stop him. The meeting with Carson had been a turning point. Ayanna had seen something in his eyes, a glimmer of understanding, a willingness to do what was right, no matter the cost. It had given her hope, a hope she hadn't felt in a long time, but there was still a long road ahead. Carson wasn't the only one who needed to act. The Apache needed to be ready. Ayanna had to warn them, make sure they were prepared for what was coming. She couldn't let Blackstone's plan succeed. As Ayanna reached the edge of town, she paused for a moment to catch her breath. The sky above was dotted with stars, and the cool night air helped steady her racing thoughts. She had to be careful. One wrong move and Blackstone would know she had betrayed him. The town was on edge, and she was running out of time. Ayanna made her way to the small cabin where Carson had agreed to meet her. She knew he would be there waiting. As she approached, she could see the silhouette of a figure standing near the door, the soft glow of the lantern lighting up the cabin's outline. Carson was there, just as promised. His face was set in determination, his posture relaxed but alert, ready for whatever would come next. "I did what I could," Ayanna said softly as she approached him. "I've sent word to the Apache. They'll be ready, but we have to act quickly." Carson nodded, his expression grim. "You did well, Ayanna. We don't have much time before Blackstone moves on them. We need to gather all the men we can, rally the town, and prepare for what's coming." "I'll do what I can to help," Ayanna said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the Apache will need more than just weapons. They need the element of surprise. If Blackstone knows they're coming, they'll be massacred." Carson looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "We'll make sure they don't see it coming. We'll hit him where it hurts." Ayanna's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She was beginning to trust Carson more than she ever thought she would, but the truth was, this was more than just a battle for survival. It was a battle for justice, for the future of the Apache people, and she wasn't sure how it would all end. As the two of them strategized through the night, making plans and laying out their tactics, the tension in the air grew heavier. Ayanna knew that once the sun rose, there would be no turning back. The plan was set into motion, and there was no way to predict who would make it out alive. For the first time in years, Ayanna felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But it was a fragile hope, one that could be shattered with a single wrong move. She had seen how quickly things could go wrong. She had seen the bloodshed, the betrayal, the endless cycle of violence that never seemed to end. But this time, it was different. This time, she had someone on her side who was willing to stand with her. Someone who understood that the fight wasn't just about land or power. It was about protecting what was right. By dawn, everything was in place. Carson and Ayanna led a small group of men into the heart of Apache territory, ready to face Blackstone's outlaw gang and stop them before they could strike. Ayanna knew the land better than anyone, and her knowledge of the terrain would be key in gaining the upper hand. She had one last chance to stop Blackstone's ruthless plans, but the outcome was still uncertain. As the two groups prepared to face each other, the air was thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Both sides knew this would be a battle like no other. And as the first shot was fired, Ayanna realized just how far she had come, how much she had risked to get here. She had no idea what the future would hold, but she knew that in this moment, she was doing what was right. And that was all that mattered. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the desert landscape. The night felt still, but the tension in the air was thick. Marshal Carson stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the valley below. The sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the rustling of wind through the dry grass, were drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. He had never felt so uncertain, not even when he had walked into dangerous towns or faced the most ruthless outlaws. This was different. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a battle for what was right. The plan was simple enough. Strike quickly, hit Blackstone's men where they were weakest. Carson's men, along with Ayanna's knowledge of the land, would allow them to move through the night without being detected. But the reality of it was more complicated. Blackstone was no fool. He had men posted at all the important spots, ready to fight anyone who tried to stop him. But the Apache knew their land better than anyone, and they had a fighting spirit that could not be easily broken. Ayanna walked up beside Carson, her footsteps soft and quiet as she approached. She had been with the Apache for so long that she had grown used to the silence of the desert, to the weight of uncertainty that came with every raid and every fight, but tonight felt different. She had never been so close to Blackstone, so close to the moment when everything could change. "We're ready," Ayanna said softly, her voice calm but filled with a determination Carson had come to admire. She had changed over the past few weeks. The woman who had once been trapped in a marriage to Blackstone was now someone who fought for her people, someone who was willing to risk everything for the future of the Apache. Carson nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the stakes. If they failed, it wouldn't just be another lost battle. The Apache could be wiped out, their land taken for good. Blackstone was determined to expand his empire, and if he succeeded, the Apache's way of life would be gone forever. The Apache had already lost so much. Their land had been taken from them, their people driven from their homes. What would happen to them if they didn't stand and fight? Carson didn't have the answer, but he knew one thing. If they didn't act now, there would be no future left to fight for. They had to win. The night moved forward, and soon they were ready. Carson gave the signal to move, and the group started down the path toward Blackstone's camp. It wasn't far, but every step felt like a lifetime. The darkness seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, pressing in on them, making the world feel small and suffocating. As they neared the camp, Ayanna's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the voices of Blackstone's men in the distance, but it wasn't their voices that worried her. It was the sound of her own thoughts. She had lived in Blackstone's shadow for so long, always afraid, always quiet. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had control. She was no longer just the wife of an outlaw. She was an Apache woman, fighting for her people's survival. They reached the edge of the camp, where the men had set up their tents and campfires. Blackstone's men were scattered around, but they didn't seem to notice the approaching danger. Carson's group moved quickly, silently, like shadows in the night. The Apache were experts at moving unnoticed through the land they had lived on for generations, and tonight they were using that skill to their advantage. As they closed in on the camp, Ayanna took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she couldn't let fear take over. This was it. There was no turning back. The Apache were depending on her, and Carson's men were counting on her too. They had all come this far, and now was the time to strike. The plan was simple. Take out the sentries first, move quickly through the camp, and disable Blackstone's weapons before he even knew what was happening. Ayanna was prepared for the fight. She had seen enough battles to know how to survive, but she also knew that this wasn't just about survival. It was about defeating Blackstone once and for all. The first sentry fell quietly, a quick and efficient move that set the tone for the rest of the mission. The camp remained unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. But Ayanna's heart was heavy, knowing that every step they took brought them closer to a confrontation with Blackstone himself. They moved quickly through the camp, knocking out the remaining sentries with precise, quiet moves. As the last of them fell, the camp seemed to go still, the only sounds the crackling of the campfires and the wind rustling the leaves. Ayanna could feel her pulse quicken as she approached the central tent where Blackstone was likely sleeping, unaware of the danger closing in. Carson's men surrounded the tent, and Ayanna joined them, her hands trembling slightly. She had never been so close to Blackstone, and the thought of facing him after all these years made her heart race. She had spent so long trying to escape his control, and now, in this moment, she had the chance to end it all. Carson turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. "We go in together," he said, his voice low but steady. "Stay close." Ayanna nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. This was it. This was her chance to finally take control of her own fate. She stepped forward, Carson by her side, and together they entered the tent. Blackstone was there, lying in his bed, unaware of the storm about to hit. For a moment everything seemed to freeze. The quiet of the night, the weight of the situation, the stillness of the tent, it was all too much. Ayanna's hand clenched into a fist as she stepped closer, but before she could say anything, Blackstone stirred. He opened his eyes, and for the briefest moment, Ayanna saw something in them. Surprise, maybe fear, but mostly confusion. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his power, and now, in the face of the Apache and Marshal Carson, he looked uncertain. But Ayanna wasn't going to let that hesitation change her plans. This was the moment when she could finally set things right. Without warning, Carson made his move, signaling his men to take action. The camp erupted into chaos, but for Ayanna, it was the moment of truth. She had fought for this, fought to break free from Blackstone's control, and now she was taking the first step toward the freedom she had always wanted. Blackstone rose from his bed, his hand reaching for his weapon, But it was too late. The fight had begun, and it was no longer in his hands. Ayanna stood, watching as the chaos unfolded, knowing that no matter what happened next, this battle would change everything. They had reached the point of no return, and now, the true fight for justice was about to begin. The battle raged around Ayanna as chaos filled the air. The camp had erupted into shouts and the sound of boots hitting the ground. Blackstone's men, surprised and disoriented, scrambled to defend themselves. Carson's men, along with the Apache, moved quickly and decisively, their training and knowledge of the land giving them an edge over the confused outlaws. Ayanna's heart pounded in her chest as she moved through the camp, keeping her focus on the task ahead. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would be standing here, surrounded by violence, finally confronting the man who had held her captive for so long. But now, as she fought alongside the Apache and Carson's men, there was no turning back. It had been a long road to this moment, and it was a road she had walked with determination and courage, no matter the cost. Blackstone was not going down easily. He fought back with the fury of a man who had spent his life trying to control everything around him. Ayanna could see the fire in his eyes as he swung his weapon, taking down anyone who came too close. But what he didn't understand was that the power he had once held so tightly was slipping away. This time, he was not in control. This time, it was Ayanna. It was the Apache, and it was Carson's lawmen who held the advantage. Ayanna's mind raced as she spotted Blackstone at the center of the camp. He was trying to rally his men, shouting orders as if he could still turn the tide of the battle, but Ayanna knew that it was too late. His empire of fear and violence was crumbling around him. She had done everything she could to make sure of it. The night air was thick with dust and the scent of smoke from the campfires, and yet Ayanna felt a strange calm settle over her. She had spent so many years trapped in Blackstone's world, forced to follow his every command, forced to be someone she was not. But now, she was free. This moment was her chance to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her, to stand strong and show Blackstone that his reign of terror had come to an end. She approached him cautiously, her breath steady, her body ready. Carson had told her to stay back, to let him handle Blackstone, but Ayanna knew this was something she had to do. This was her fight, her moment of redemption. Carson's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her to stay focused. But the truth was, she no longer needed his protection. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to fight for what was right, and to never back down. Blackstone finally saw her approaching, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "You think you can stop me, girl?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Ayanna stood tall, her expression unwavering. "You've done enough damage," she said quietly, but with strength that she hadn't known she possessed until now. "This ends tonight." With that, she stepped forward, and the final confrontation between them began. Blackstone lunged at her, swinging his weapon in a desperate attempt to catch her off guard, but Ayanna was ready. She dodged his blow and countered with a swift strike of her own. It wasn't just the physical act of the fight that mattered. It was the fight for her freedom, her people's freedom, and the future they would now have. Carson and the Apache warriors were finishing off the last of Blackstone's men, making sure that there would be no escape for the Outlaw King. But Ayanna didn't take her eyes off Blackstone. This was personal. She had lived under his shadow for far too long, and now, for the first time, she had the power to end it. Blackstone, however, was not a man to give up so easily. He had spent his entire life building his power, crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. But in the face of Ayanna's resolve, in the face of the Apache and Carson's men, he was losing. His world was crumbling, and he knew it. "You think you're going to win?" he spat. "You're nothing. You're just a pawn. You always were." Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "Not anymore," she said, her voice calm but firm. With that, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Blackstone tried to strike again, but Ayanna was faster. She moved with precision, and with a single well-placed strike, she disarmed him. The weapon fell to the ground with a soft thud, and for a moment, everything was still. Blackstone stood there, staring at Ayanna, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was defeated, his empire of violence and control brought down by the very woman he had tried to control for so long. It was over. Ayanna's heart pounded as she stared down at him, but she didn't feel the triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a deep sense of relief. It was finally over. She had fought for so long to be free, and now she was. The weight that had been on her shoulders for so many years was gone, and she could finally breathe. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she had helped her people. As Blackstone was taken into custody by Carson's men, Ayanna stepped back, her eyes searching the camp. The Apache had emerged victorious, their land reclaimed, and the future was no longer uncertain. The battle had been hard, and the cost had been high, but the outcome had been worth it. They had won, not through violence, but through determination, courage, and unity. Ayanna looked over at Carson, who was overseeing the prisoners being taken. His eyes met hers, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both fought for something greater than themselves, and they had both come through it stronger. They had done what needed to be done. "I couldn't have done it without you," Ayanna said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. Carson gave a small nod, his expression softening. "You did all the hard work," he replied. "You've been fighting for this for a long time. You're the one who brought this victory." Ayanna smiled, the weight on her shoulders finally lifting. It had been a long journey, but now, as she looked out over the camp, she saw the beginning of a new chapter. The Apache were free, and she was free. For the first time in years, Ayanna felt hope for the future. It was a future she would help build, a future where the Apache would no longer be oppressed, where they could live on their land in peace, and where she could finally live the life she had always dreamed of. As the sun began to rise over the desert, casting its warm light on the battlefield, Ayanna knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice had been won, but the work was far from over. But now she had the strength, the courage, and the people beside her to face whatever came next, and for the first time she believed that anything was possible.